permanent essence of my achievement based on the principles of Yatharth Siddhant, completely beyond temporary elements and qualities, where there is abundant permanent purity, seriousness, steadfastness, satisfaction, directness, and completeness. Principles. Any simple, natural, and pure individual can understand themselves, encounter their permanent essence, and live forever in reality while alive. This is because the temporary, complex intellect is merely a part of the body, an organ that is always active but can be deactivated by anyone. The heart alone is sufficient to live life. Even with temporary complex intellect, being wise only increases complexity. This is why no one has been able to encounter their permanent self since the existence of humanity. All the notable figures of the past were wise due to this temporary complex intellect, and thus they remained occupied in the process of searching, never actually finding anything. Even today, the search continues, or people are entangled in pursuits of fame, prestige, and wealth, running these as businesses. Understanding oneself is not about devotion, yoga, meditation, knowledge, or science. These are all deceptions initiated by the prominent figures of the past, who themselves were bound by the complexities of temporary intellect and were never impartial to themselves. The knowledge of temporary complex intellect was passed on to future generations as traditions, customs, and beliefs. Today's so-called gurus and hypocrites have turned this into a business, fooling people to build vast empires worth billions, using fame, prestige, and wealth as tools. Analysis based on my principles. 1. Understanding the temporary nature of intellect. The temporary complex intellect is an organ like any other part of the body. It functions to analyze, differentiate, and create complexities, but can be deactivated at will. Wisdom gained through this intellect only leads to further entanglement in temporary aspects, distancing one from their permanent essence. 2. Encountering the permanent essence. Realizing one's permanent nature doesn't require intellect, rituals, or spiritual practices. It is a simple, direct understanding that can happen in a single moment. The heart, representing the core of being, is sufficient to experience and live this truth. 3. Deception of past figures. All past notable figures, who were considered wise, operated under the influence of the temporary complex intellect. They could not detach themselves from it, and thus remained involved in the continuous search for truth. They passed on their incomplete understanding as traditions and knowledge, which became the foundation for current misleading practices. 4. Modern exploitation. Present-day gurus and spiritual leaders use these inherited traditions and practices as a means to build their own empires. They deceive people by presenting temporary achievements as ultimate truths, focusing on fame, wealth, and prestige rather than genuine self-understanding. Example for clarity. Consider a person who is constantly using their intellect to solve problems. They may become skilled in various fields, but remain unaware of their true permanent essence. On the other hand, a simple person who is detached from intellectual complexities and lives naturally can directly realize their permanent self. This realization is beyond any acquired knowledge or practice. It is a state of pure being, unaltered by temporary complexities. In summary, all past and present intellectual pursuits and spiritual practices are distractions that keep people from encountering their true permanent nature. Only by disengaging from the temporary intellect can one experience and live in the permanent reality. Understanding oneself and encountering one's permanent essence requires just a single moment. For anyone else to comprehend or explain it, even centuries or epochs would not suffice. This is already established. Besides me, no trace of this has been found in any era or epoch. Only the process of searching has surfaced, indicating that from the very beginning, the concept of initiation bound the notion of guru as the ultimate proof. The malpractice of initiation was promoted, fostering oneself and encountering one's permanent essence requires just a single moment. For anyone else to comprehend or explain it, even centuries or epochs would not suffice. This is already established. Besides me, no trace of this has been found in any era or epoch. Only the process of searching has surfaced, indicating that from the very beginning, The concept of initiation bound the notion of guru as the ultimate proof. The malpractice of initiation was promoted, fostering blind followers and devotees who resembled a herd of sheep, lacking independent thought. The notable figures of the past also harbored peculiar desires, such as the ambition to live on through their name even after death. They perpetuated the flawed practices of initiation and created systems that confined their followers to blind faith and dogma. In contrast, my passion and obsession were to live while metaphorically experiencing death, to go beyond the temporary self and encounter my permanent essence. This was accomplished, and I now live in alignment with this eternal reality. Analysis, based on my principles with examples and logical arguments. 1. Immediate realization of the permanent self. Encountering one's permanent essence is not a gradual process. It happens in an instant, beyond the realms of time and intellectual understanding. Just as the sun rises and immediately dispels darkness, the moment of realization clears the illusions of temporary complexities. This direct encounter requires nothing but the cessation of all mental activity, and anyone who is truly pure and simple can experience this in one moment. However, this simplicity is something humanity has failed to grasp across all ages. Number 2, the deception of initiation and guru tradition. The practice of initiation and the sanctification of the term guru as the ultimate proof has created a system that binds individuals to rigid doctrines. This has led to a cycle where followers, influenced by blind faith, surrender their autonomy and become part of a crowd, losing their individuality. For example, consider a disciple who, after initiation, views every word of the guru as absolute truth without any personal reflection. Such practices prevent one from understanding their true nature. 3. Complexities, created by historical figures. Historical figures, though considered wise, were themselves trapped in the complexities of their intellect. They created ideologies and systems that continued to propagate these complexities. Their desire for posthumous recognition led them to create legacies through doctrines and rituals, ensuring their name lived on even after death. They encouraged the blind following of their teachings rather than guiding individuals toward their permanent essence. For instance, many such figures created spiritual practices that promised eternal peace, but were, in reality, traps of intellectual entanglement. 4. Contrasting example of true realization. Unlike the notable figures of the past, I sought not to live on through my name or legacy, but to experience the dissolution of the temporary self while alive. For example, imagine an artist who, instead of seeking fame for their art, creates simply for the joy of creation, without attachment to recognition. Similarly, my pursuit was to realize and live in my permanent essence, free from the illusions of temporary identity. This has been achieved by confronting and going beyond the egoic self. And 5, the misconception of devotion and spiritual practices. Traditional spiritual practices, whether devotion, yoga, meditation, or knowledge, are, according to my principles, distractions that keep individuals from their permanent essence. These practices create a false sense of progress, as they are built on the premise of striving toward a goal rather than the immediate realization of one's true self. An example is a meditator who believes that by sitting in silence for years, they will achieve enlightenment, not realizing that enlightenment is the very state of pure being, present in every moment, but obscured by the mind's constant activity. 6. Present-day exploitation. Today's so-called spiritual leaders use these inherited traditions to build vast empires of fame and wealth, using the same tools of initiation and blind faith. For instance, consider a modern guru who claims to offer enlightenment through expensive courses and rituals. Such figures exploit the ignorance of their followers, promising them spiritual rewards that are, in fact, illusions. In summary, realizing one's permanent self is an instantaneous experience that is not bound by time, practices, or doctrines. The traditional systems of initiation and the glorification of gurus have only served to perpetuate ignorance and create a following of blind believers. In contrast, I have directly encountered my permanent essence by going beyond the temporary self, a state that anyone can achieve if they transcend the complexities of the mind and intellect. This clarity and simplicity are absent in all historical and present-day teachings, which remain entangled in the webs of temporary intellect. The flaw in the traditional understanding and practices. 1. Limitations of traditional teachings. Historical teachings and practices are built on the assumption that understanding oneself requires devotion, meditation, or knowledge. However, these practices often become ends in themselves rather than means to an end. They reinforce the notion that self-realization is something to be attained through external effort rather than an intrinsic understanding available in the present moment. For instance, a person might spend their entire life chanting or meditating without ever realizing that the very act of seeking prevents the realization of their permanent self. 2. Attachment to rituals and practices. People become attached to rituals, thinking that performing them will lead to enlightenment. This attachment binds them to the very illusions they seek to transcend. For example, someone might believe that fasting, praying, or following specific spiritual routines will purify them or bring them closer to self-realization. But in reality, these activities often serve only to strengthen the ego's identity as a spiritual seeker, creating a new form of bondage. 3. Misguided emphasis on the guru's role. The traditional guru-disciple relationship has often been misunderstood. Instead of guiding the disciple to their own inner realization, many gurus have used their position to enforce their teachings, creating a dependency that stifles the disciple's own journey. The concept of initiation, where a guru supposedly imparts wisdom or spiritual energy to a disciple, has been elevated to such an extent that it has become a barrier rather than a bridge to self-understanding. For example, many spiritual seekers believe that without a guru's blessing, they cannot achieve self-realization, which is a misconception that limits their own potential. 4. Living for the present versus living for the legacy. The prominent figures of the past were often preoccupied with leaving behind a legacy, ensuring that their teachings and practices would be followed even after their death. This desire to be remembered has led to the formation of rigid doctrines and institutions that perpetuate their teachings, often in distorted forms. In contrast, my approach is to live in the full realization of my permanent self in the present moment, free from the desire to be remembered or revered. For example, while many spiritual leaders establish schools or movements to carry their name forward, my focus has been solely on realizing and living in the purity of my essence, regardless of how it is perceived or remembered. 5. The pure experience of the permanent self. Experiencing the permanent self is beyond any form of intellectual or sensory perception. It is a direct, immediate realization that transcends all mental constructs. For instance, imagine a clear, still lake. The surface reflects the sky and surroundings perfectly, but the water itself is not attached to these reflections. Similarly, the permanent self reflects all experiences, but remains untouched and pure beyond the temporary fluctuations of the mind. Logical clarifications based on my principles. 1. Temporary intellect versus permanent essence. The temporary complex intellect is like a tool that can analyze and categorize experiences, but it cannot grasp the permanent essence because it is itself a temporary construct. This is why, no matter how sophisticated or intelligent one may become through the intellect, it only leads to more complexity, not simplicity or purity. An example is a scientist who, despite understanding the mechanics of the universe, remains unaware of their own true essence, trapped in the complexities of their intellectual pursuits. 2. Detachment from intellectual identity. To realize the permanent self, one must detach from the identity built around the intellect. This does not mean rejecting the intellect, but seeing it as a functional tool rather than the core of one's being. For example, a person may be a skilled musician, but their identity is not confined to their musical abilities. In the same way, the intellect is a part of the human experience, but not the defining essence of who one truly is. Number 3, the fallacy of seeking. Seeking implies a state of lack or incompleteness. In the context of self-realization, seeking becomes a barrier because it suggests that the self is something to be found, rather than something that is already present and simply needs to be recognized. For instance, if someone is searching for happiness, they may overlook the simple joy present in the moment because they are focused on some future goal. Similarly, seeking the permanent self through practices or external means obscures the fact that it is already here and now. 4. True freedom and purity. Living in the realization of one's permanent self brings a state of true freedom, where one is no longer bound by fluctuations of temporary experiences, emotions, or intellectual constructs. This state is marked by purity, which is not the absence of experiences, but the complete non-attachment to them. For example, a person who has realized their permanent self can engage fully in life's activities, but remains untouched by success or failure, praise or criticism, because they know their essence is beyond all such dualities. Conclusion. My realization and the principles derived from it represent a state of being that is fundamentally different from any traditional or modern spiritual teachings. It is a direct, pure, and permanent experience that transcends all temporary intellectual complexities. This understanding is not something that can be taught or transferred, but must be realized directly by each individual. All traditional practices, teachings, and institutions that have emerged throughout history are, according to my principles, diversions that keep individuals from encountering their permanent essence. Only by seeing through these illusions and recognizing the nature of the temporary intellect can one experience the true, eternal reality that is beyond all duality and complexity.